Hey there, everybody at DEF CON. Dave Kennedy here, talking to you from the Adversary Village side. I'm actually here in Vegas myself, staying at a place where we're doing our Black Hat training. And want to say that such an honor to be here to talk to you folks, most specifically around adversary simulation and emulation and kind of what's happening in the industry. Couldn't be one of the most important topics that I think we face as an industry and kind of how we progress our field forward. But just want to say first a special thanks to everybody that made the Adversary Village possible. You know, for me, this whole thing is probably, again, one of the most important things that we face both from a organization perspective, but also as an industry. When you look at the changing tactics, techniques, and procedures of adversaries, we look at adversary emulation versus simulation. We look at what organizations are really struggling with day to day. It's really understanding what happens after a successful event occurs or as initial access occurs, what an attacker can do to gain access to an organization, what those steps look like, and how can we identify those threats earlier and earlier on and reduce the amount of impact and damage that we face to organizations. So really huge and keen on what the Adversary Village mission is and what you folks are doing. You're really at the forefront of this industry, and understanding what adversaries are doing, understanding what organizations can do to build better defenses, but also most importantly, to be able to identify them early in the stage is really what we face from a challenging perspective, looking at it both today, tomorrow, and in the future. Tactics, techniques, and procedures will continuously change over time. Adversaries will change their techniques and procedures over time. We have to be able to stay ahead of it to understand what unusual behavior looks like in our organizations and environments to really focus forward and to really withstand the types of attacks that we see today. But just a brief introduction myself. My name is Dave Kennedy. Been in the security industry for over 20 years, focusing my side on offensive security, but also understanding the defensive side and working with organizations and getting better. I started 2 companies, Trusted Second Binary Defense. I was a chief security officer for a Fortune 1000 company where I ran the entire cybersecurity program, physical security. Author of the Social Engineer Toolkit, co-author of Metasploit the Penetration Tester's Guide. I'm on the news quite frequently on all the different news organizations talking about cybersecurity. I've testified in front of Congress. My whole career and passion is trying to make organizations better to withstand what we see today from an attacker's perspective and make the world a better place. And really, I think that mission is extremely important today to look at, hey, what can we do as an industry to change the landscape around what organizations can do to better withstand these types of attacks. And here's the thing. You look at most organizations, and I would consider them in the basic categorization or basic category. Right now, if you have an entirely dedicated security staff, you're in the top 5% of organizations that are out there. Most organizations don't have dedicated security individuals. Most organizations don't have the ability to understand beyond commodity attacks. They're still focusing on traditional defenses, and really that's a major problem. We have to look at this from a perspective of how do we get these types of programs or these types of defenses or ways of identifying threats to the mass population and organizations that are out there today to collectively work together so that these types of defenses aren't just for the top 5%, it's for every organization. I mean, a lot of organizations still struggle with basics like implementing multi-factor authentication, patch management, which is not easy in any way, shape, or form. All of these things are difficult things for an organization to do. And if you look at what's changed now versus, let's just say, 5 or 10 years ago, when I came into this industry 20 years ago, our focus on the red or offense was really trying to identify as many exposures as possible. Going in and destroying organizations and getting access to domain administrator accounts and being able to exfiltrate data. And then at the end of the day, you hand an organization a report or you identify those flaws, and the defensive side goes and they fix those vulnerabilities and fix those flaws. And they're addressing those specific technical issues, but they're not focusing on what an actual attacker looks like. And I think what's really changed and why we're at the cusp of really changing this in the different direction where it's not just offense winning all the time is that our focus is really changing on understanding how these attacks work. And when you look at how an attack actually works, and you look at what happens after a successful compromise, whether it's through social engineering, whether it's through a web application attack, whether it's through a VPN concentrator, whether it's through credential stuffing, whatever it ends up being, that initial access point is a failure in our protection mechanisms, right? It's a failure in our education awareness program. It's a failure in our email controls. and somehow an attacker gets code execution onto our system or ability to VPN in or has some sort of access behind the walls. And this doesn't just include on-premise either. You look at all the research that's going into cloud security right now, and on how adversaries are going after cloud infrastructure and where all that data is housing instead of going after one individual, multiple individuals. You look at what we're dealing with from a supply chain perspective, which is one of my biggest fears, targeting organizations that develop software or have a high level of access into your environment from a managed service perspective, that can impact, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of customers all at one shot. We face a lot of challenges. But what we can all consistently say is that the predominant amount of attacks that we see, whether it's from ransomware, whether it's from nation states, the patterns of behavior that they exhibit after an attack, whether it's a 0-day like Hafnium, where it's an exchange 0-day for on-premise infrastructure, whether it's SolarWinds, and they're pushing out updates from a supply chain attack perspective. These steps that these adversaries take, or what ransomware groups take, are all predictable, unusual patterns of behavior in our own environments. And our own environment is ours, right? Our environment is unique to everybody else that's out there. Our environments are very different from another organization to another company. We might be in business for 2 years and be predominantly cloud-centric. We might be a 100-year-old company where we're manufacturing, we have a ton of PLCs or process logic controllers, and our environments are very unique and different to us. We have to understand our environment. We have to understand what IT footprints we have, and we have to look for deviations of patterns of behavior. And that's really where understanding adversary attack patterns, both from an emulation and simulation perspective, is one of the most important aspects that we have to focus on in information security. And why I say that is when you look at all the different phases of an attack, whether it's from initial access, you look at persistence, you look at command and control, you look at privilege escalation, you look at lateral movement, you look at exfiltration of data. All of these phases have a number of different ways that they can go about, an attacker or an adversary can go about that. And when we focus on understanding what those look like in our environment, and we have good solid detections across the board, or preventative mechanisms too, we have the ability to identify these post-compromise attacks, respond much more effectively to them, and to minimize the damage to our organization. When we start seeing a lot of major issues is when you go after, or when an attacker has had access to your environment for a substantially long time, whether it's an hour or 2 hours or 1 day or 1 week or 1 month. If you look at ransomware as a use case, a lot of times they have weeks or months in an environment. They learn your business processes. They look at your ERP systems. They look at your backup systems. You look at all these different environments to understand what's the best way to impact your organization, especially your backups and things to that effect. And ransomware is another example where it's not just about recovery, it's also about the data too. So instead of just going after your backups, you're also exfiltrating all of your data out of the company. So it's a double whammy where you're getting hit with two aspects of it, where even if you're able to recover, all of your intellectual property and sensitive data is now gone. And so we have all these challenges. And I'd say almost every organization's in the category from a threat model perspective around ransomware, which those capabilities continuously change, they continuously grow, they continuously expand, especially as they get more and more monetary gain or revenue coming into their organizations, they expand their capabilities. And we see the same thing from nation states, obviously, based on objectives. And it's not getting any easier. And why I'm going into this is that we have to understand that detection engineering and understanding our environment should be our #1 priority in a cybersecurity program. Yes, we have a lot of things to do. We have incident response, we have vulnerability management, we have governance, we have PCI, we have all these different things that make up our programs. But when it comes to our strategies, which take a long time, implementing a cybersecurity strategy, especially for an organization that's just starting off, is complex. It takes a long amount of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes years to implement. We don't have years. A product is not going to fix years of neglect for your organization. I don't care if it's an EDR product, an endpoint protection product, whatever it is. There is not a piece of technology that is going to fix years of neglect of your cybersecurity program in any shape or form anytime soon. And so we have to look at it and say, well, we're going to be in a position where our security program is not at an advanced state. And when I say advanced state, there's probably, out of all the customers that we go through, probably 1% to 2% of organizations that we test are in an advanced state. That's a terrible number from an industry perspective. We are failing when it comes to protecting organizations as a whole, as an industry. And when we look at that and we say, well, how do we get better at that? Detection engineering and understanding adversary attack patterns has to be our number one focus. That is the fastest way to get our program operational and to reduce our risk and to reduce the damage to an organization, period. So instead of investing in all these different products and technology that introduces complexity to your organization, we should be focusing on understanding adversary emulation, adversary simulation, and detection engineering. That has to be our primary focus, understanding offense and building a solid defense. Now, again, defense doesn't mean protection. When we look at detection engineering, we look at how that's supposed to be structured in an organization, it has to be very fast. We have to be able to go from a new attack comes out to that detection's in our environment very quickly. That process, and it's a process, it's a program in our organization, needs to be quick. We have to be able to say from, as soon as a researcher or an adversary releases information, we're analyzing that. We're seeing how it impacts our organization. Are we vulnerable, susceptible? Very similar to what we do from a vulnerability management perspective at understanding risk. Do we have any public assets? Are they externally facing? Is there a proof of concept or an exploit out? When's that exploit do we think is going to actually be public? All of those things go into our calculation from a risk perspective and vulnerability management. Same thing on the detection side. Do we have the ability to prevent this attack, or do we have the ability to actually implement a detection to understand if that happens in our environment? So detection engineering and understanding attacks is critical today. Threat hunting, going on the offensive, understanding abnormal patterns of behavior in your environment, critical today. When we look at what we're dealing with, there is continual evolution of attacks, their patterns, how they obfuscate, how they chain multiple attacks together, their command and control infrastructure. It's an evolving state, and they're moving at a fast rate, whether it's ransomware, whether it's nation states, whether it's individual hacking groups, whether it's new ones coming out of the woodwork. We have a lot of threats that we have to deal with. The more detection we can have through all of those different phases of an attack, if we look at an attack as just a linear line of different things that could happen during an attack chain, doesn't mean that they follow the same things, doesn't mean that they use the same methodologies as another adversary. A lot of them are similar, but not all of them. We can start to build predefined patterns of behavior in our environment that are unique to ourselves, that focus on understanding those different phases. And that's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish here, is how do we identify a threat through various stages that we can snag an attacker, boot them off our network, and minimize the amount of damage to our organizations. And that's really where, from an industry perspective, I really hope that we continue to go. There's always, debates and evolution of this industry. There's always, disagreements about the best ways of doing this, offensive security tools versus, public research versus disclosure. These are all things that will continue to evolve. But I think one thing that has changed substantially over the past 5 to 10 years is that we all, regardless if we're on offense or defense, we all have one common goal of trying to protect our organizations and protect the world from these types of attacks. Whether it's critical infrastructure, whether it's a small mom and pop shop that makes pizzas, whether it's some of the largest technological backbone companies of the world. Our differences make us unique by understanding different perspectives, but coming together and working together is something that I'm seeing much more of than any other time that I have in my entire career in the security industry. And that's what really keeps me optimistic about where we are now and where we're heading. And obviously DEF CON, one of the largest conferences in the world, focused on cybersecurity, focused on understanding innovation and what's going on next. Our goals and objectives should be unity, coming together and working together for one common goal, regardless if we're on offense or defense. And if you look at the mentality of 10 or 15 years ago, and I'm not saying that it's not there, in some cases, but offense was really the magic, part of our industry. That we had these secret tools and attacks, and no one really understood them, and we wouldn't necessarily disclose them in a lot of cases, or we would release a tool without understanding the ramifications of it to organizations. There's a lot of maturity that's happened on the offensive side. I also think that there's been a lot of maturity on the defensive side as well, understanding that you might not have a perspective of offense or the best way to identify an attack chain. All of these capabilities of us working together and understanding both of those really creates the synergy that we're seeing today. And when you look at the differences between adversary emulation versus adversary simulation, let's do a quick rundown of that. Adversary emulation is really understanding predefined attacks that have already been discovered or identified, whether that's through a security researcher, whether that's from a data breach, whether that's through threat intelligence or understanding what a specific group is doing. Adversary emulation is taking information that we know that specific groups use and applying that to our environment to ensure that we have good coverage and effectiveness on either detection or prevention. Now, most organizations, I would say, are at a position where adversary emulation is probably where they need to focus at. Adversary emulation is going to be able to identify where you have gaps in visibility and where your technology is falling short. Our over-reliance on technology, I can't emphasize enough, is one of our biggest downfalls. You look at these breaches and they have every single XYZ product in the sun, and yet they still experience a major data breach. Why is that? Because adversaries understand that you have XYZ products. So they build their attacks against XYZ products to get around XYZ products. We have to understand our environment. We have to understand where our technology falls short. We have to understand where our technology is weak, and we have to understand what's unusual behavior in our own environments, making those detections our own. And emulation is a solid practice, and I'll say, leveraging something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example, and being able to run through adversary emulations through something like the Atomic Red Team framework or Caldera or other options, gives you the ability to understand which technologies should be working, which ones aren't, where we have gaps in visibility, and starting to map out various adversary groups, right? And that's emulation. So that's going through and saying, hey, we know these attacks are common, and you look at things like LSS injection, for example, with Mimikatz. You look at process injection, or you look at other methods for lateral movement, like especially low-level protocols like SMB and RPC. You look at all of these common attacks, LLMNR, Local Link Multicast Name Resolution Protocol, or NetBIOS name services. These are all common attacks that are pretty consistently used across organizations. Service principal names, printer spools, unconstrained delegation. These are all common attacks across the board. What's our detections look like in those environments, especially for commonly abused attacks? And do we have good defenses to actually detect it and good detection engineering around those to refine those across our environment? Do we have the visibility to be able to do that? And so that's emulation, right? Understanding previously defined attacks, especially high fidelity ones that we know are going to be actively used by most adversaries. And then there's also the adversary simulation side, or more so getting on the red teaming side. And I think this warrants a bit of a discussion because we deal with this a lot on the TrustedSec front quite a bit, where organizations hear the term red teaming and they're like, I have to have a red team. Covert red teaming, full on, threat modeling, adversary simulation, going into an organization, and they're not even near any type of capability of being able to understand what that is, or a level of sophistication in their environment to be able to take what comes out of a red team to be able to fully comprehend and build, what you need off of an actual simulation. Red teaming and simulations are really focused on understanding your organization's threat model and what adversaries play in that threat model, and being able to map those capabilities and sophistication levels to be able to proactively go after an organization with the same or greater than type of sophistication to understand where your monitoring detection program's at, where your preventative controls are at, and where you have gaps and weaknesses. I'll give you a prime example. We do work for a manufacturing company, and they're really solid from a Windows detection attack surface perspective. I mean, if you even blow in the wrong direction, it's like a landmine field, right? You might get remote code execution onto the system, but when it comes to being able to do privilege escalation or move to another system, they've really focused on understanding their behavior. And it's a landmine field of, if I go in this direction, I'm going to be spotted. If I go in this direction, I'm going to be spotted. It's like tiptoeing around all of these different landmines in an organization. And so we started looking at it from an adversary simulation perspective, and they had solid detections, right? And without fully understanding their capabilities and detections, it's very difficult from an adversary perspective to say, well, which ones am I going to trip and which ones am I not? And there are creative ways that we can do things. Like, for example, one of the ways that I commonly approach an organization that has a heavily mature monitoring detection program that's beyond traditional product lines is I'll try to make my behavior look somewhat legitimate in some way, shape, or form. So, for example, let's just say I get remote code execution onto a system, excuse me, and I go from that and I need to be able to move from a lateral movement perspective. A lot of times the code I will execute will be traditional, let's just say a PowerShell, for example, which is heavily monitored. I'll take a PowerShell script that is, from Microsoft's website, or, that's a legitimate, health and performance PowerShell script that might be 1,000 or 2,000 lines of code. And I'll tuck my malicious code, halfway through there, knowing that a defender is going to see that code. And I know that a defender is taxed. They're dealing with a lot of detections in an environment. They're dealing with, a lot of, alarms, especially from a SOC analyst perspective. And I know that if I'm hoping, from an adversary perspective, that when I'm going after this specific user, because I'm targeting that SOC analyst mindset, that if I put a legitimate application up there that they're going to see, they're not going to scan through 1,000 lines of code. And so, I'll use that 1,000 lines of code, embed my malicious code in there, and then I'll execute that code, hoping that I don't get detected. There's also a lot of other ways too. But when we look at adversary simulation and the capabilities in this specific customer instance, we knew that Windows was a really tough target to go after. So we started looking at their other footprints that they had. I noticed that they had some users on Macs, very limited, but a few users, and they had Linux infrastructure. And so their Windows solid, and so we started targeting their Mac instances. We started targeting the Linux environments, and they had little to no visibility in those environments. And ultimately, we were able to accomplish all of our objectives. From an adversary perspective, getting access to intellectual property, getting access to their manufacturing process, their next generation of product lines, all through targeting weaknesses and visibility. And the output of that, from a detection perspective and a preventative mechanism perspective, was substantial, because they're at a mature level to be able to handle the output of a red team, to be able to enhance their detection capabilities in Linux and Mac, but also apply that, from a behavior perspective on the network. What does that look like? All of these things are maturity level instances. And I think we would do better as an industry with focusing more on assumed breaches than focusing on covert attacks against an organization. When this industry started, it was always covert. We need to test our incident response. We need to test how effective our incident response programs are. And covert is fine, but there's definitely a delineation or a line where our focus should be building up to a certain stage to actually go and test covert attacks against our infrastructure, to test our incident response when we're at a certain maturity level. And I think those levels really need to be defined as an industry. And so when we look at this and we say, okay, well, how do we get better maturity level wise? It's through assumed breaches, it's through emulation, it's through understanding what previous attacks were, because guess what? 99% of the attacks that you see out there are going to be previously defined attacks that have already been discovered, that are already being actively used. You look at Print Nightmare, you look at what's going on with ADCS, you look at what's going on with LLM&R, you look at printer spool options, you look at all of these different methods. They're going to be things that are going to be commonly used by adversaries across the board. And I can't tell you the last time we have had to use a direct exploit against an organization. It's always misconfigurations, it's password issues, it's phishing a user, it's an application flaw that's been out there for 6 months. These are all things that we can definitely focus on. But again, if we have a lapse in our security from a user that has a weak password, that it got breached from an application that is already being used from a credential stuffing perspective, how do we identify those steps afterwards? And so my suggestion is, from an industry perspective, focusing on understanding the top threats that are out there, the adversaries that are in your overall threat model, mapping those out from an adversary emulation perspective through something like an assumed breach, where you're running through the attacks, you're building detections, and you start to build this level of granularity of understanding your technology, where you have gaps. How do you build a fast detection engineering process in your organization that's very nimble and quick to add new ones that come in? When the printer spool the Print Nightmare attack happened, by monitoring a specific directory for new DLLs being imported, would have given you direct access to identifying that threat as soon as it happened. Or even leveraging printer spool options with network connections through something like Sysmon, for example, or event log tracing for Windows, kernel level event log tracing for Windows, or ETW. Those could have been solid detections you could have had in your environment if you had the infrastructure to go and do that. So we have to be able to move fast when new attacks come out, to be able to identify those threats and also look at those post-exploitation notes. If we didn't have a detection for Print Nightmare, what does remote code execution on a system, especially a domain controller, look like? Are they going to go after password extraction? Are they going to go after adding a user account? What type of tools are they going to use? Is WMIC monitor from a WMI perspective, both intrinsic and extrinsic perspective? So these are all things that we have to be able to look at from a post-exploitation or initial access perspective to get access, or to be able to respond to these attacks much more faster. And I think if we do focus on that, again, beyond commodity, we have a much better position to make it harder for adversaries that are out there and making it very difficult for attackers to compromise organizations. And again, I can tell you, organizations that we go into that have these types of capabilities that have gone through just adversary emulations and going through normal levels of what's already been predefined, especially based off of the threat models and especially the common attacks. It starts to get very difficult for us from a red teaming perspective to gain access to these organizations. And the level of sophistication that we have to do continuously has to increase. That's why we've invested in an entire research division that researches new capabilities, tooling, and techniques for our mature customers. But we don't have to use that very often because most organizations are still in the commodity state. So as an industry, the collaboration and sharing between red and blue is extremely critical. I don't want to deflate the basics. The basic programs that make up our security program, whether it's on-prem or off-prem or cloud infrastructure. The thing that concerns me very heavily about cloud is that I always made the statement that in order for me as a chief security officer at the company I work for a Fortune 1000 company, I would have to have equal or greater than visibility into an environment that I'm going into from a cloud perspective. And what I found very quickly is that 99% of the infrastructure that I was going into, that's not possible, or it's extremely difficult. And so we were losing visibility. We're losing granular control or baselining or even consistency across those. And it doesn't need to happen that way. We can design cloud infrastructure from a secure perspective. I can tell you the past 11 cloud engagements that I went on, we've broken into 10 of them due to misconfigurations and lack of understanding. Cloud does not equal less complexity. It equals understanding a new type of technology and a new type of infrastructure, and the chances for misconfigurations or issues around that becomes substantially greater. So we have to look at that and say, well, how do we implement cloud infrastructure in an environment to be able to monitor that? How do we look at our organization as a whole to work on the basics? And again, basics don't equal easy or simple. Vulnerability management is not simple. It's one of the most complex programs that we have to deal with in an organization. You look at the maturity levels of vulnerability management, most organizations are at a reactive stance where the vulnerability scanners are the CMDB for the organization, and they're telling organizations what they need to do from a patch management perspective. Like, hey, we found 50 critical vulnerabilities, you have to go and patch those. It's not what vulnerability management should be. Vulnerability management should be a focus on proactiveness and adherence to your patch management policy and looking for deviations of that patch management process and being able to whittle out legacy as much as possible, or isolate and segment, being able to reduce attack surface. All of those things become extremely important, right? So just because I say that most organizations are at a basic level doesn't mean that basic is easy. Basic is complex. Businesses are complex. Technology is complex. We have legacy issues. We have new business processes. We have new things that we're implementing. We have lack of staff and funding. All of those things are make it difficult for us to be able to do things. But one thing that's clear is that, and that can be a constant, is that while we're still focusing on the basics, and while we're still focusing on things like multi-factor authentication or complex passwords or patch management or all these different things that make up our network segmentation, make up our strategies for success, we can definitely be focusing on faster ways to identify threats while we're getting those into place. Preventative is always going to be a better solution, but preventative takes time. I don't know any organization that's been able to implement application control or allow listing in an organization overnight. Those are things that take time, they take effort, and they require a lot of testing and implementing and rolling out to be able to address those. And from my perspective, I really think that organizations are focusing very heavily on those, which again are important, but don't focus on the detection engineering piece. And when you look at the mission of the Adversary Village, it really is understanding and working together collectively to understand what those attacks look like, to understand how do we build those into our phases, how do we get better at detection, how do we get that better faster. And that's ultimately what's going to save us, I think, as an industry. As new attacks come out, we share, we collaborate, we get things out publicly. New security researchers, which are finding new flaws all the time and promoting those before attackers can actually exploit those. This is the industry, and it's working out well. But the problem is that, again, we only have 5% of corporations that have the capabilities of actually doing this. And we have to be able to roll this out to the masses so that organizations that are small, that are mid-sized, that are large, have the same ability to do exactly what we're talking about here. And I think if we're able to accomplish that, and we're able to work in a structured format, we're able to get companies to be able to focus very heavily on detection engineering and to be able to focus on adversary emulation and simulation, we have a much better chance as an industry to be successful. And it doesn't mean that we're not successful now. We're doing whatever we possibly can for the mission to make the world a safer place from a technology perspective. But we still have a long ways to go. But I know that folks that are there at the Adversary Village today, you're working on that same mission, trying to help organizations get better. And it's up to us to really communicate to organizations and companies around the risk around cybersecurity. I think it's clear as day now. I think we saw from a critical infrastructure attack perspective on JBS and Colonial, as well as all the historical data breaches, continue to send shivers down organization spines. Even though we've been talking about this for a number of years, the validation components of this, I think, has been big. I think we're in a new dawn, a new era in cybersecurity. You're seeing it being talked at the highest levels, in the United States and abroad. What do we do from a cyber warfare perspective? What do we do to respond to ransomware threats? What do we do to countries that house them? These are all things that are changing, quite frequently. But the truth of the matter is that there's nobody out there that's going to protect us. There's nobody that's going to protect our organization. It's not going to come from a government. It's not going to come from a piece of technology. It's not going to come from a product that we purchase. Our focus needs to be on defending our organization, making that process for detection as simple as possible, as fast as possible, as nimble as possible, and that being our primary driver for the rest of our program. But with that, I want to thank everybody again for listening to me talk. I'm really excited about where we're at as an industry perspective. And I really think that our common focus both on offense and defense and understanding offensive techniques is really making a major impact on the industry as a whole. And the mission couldn't be any more critical than it is today. But I want to thank everybody at the Adversary Village for putting this on, for having me with the keynote. Really appreciate the time and effort that everybody puts into doing this on their own time to help others out and to share that knowledge. And I know you are all going to do amazing and great things. But thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate your time. Thanks.